So thank you very much for coming and joining me in this session. This session is a bit about one topic that is close to my heart and that actually got me into the field of information theory originally. It was about sensor evolution. I'm not so much going to speak about sensor evolution per se, but I will mention a couple of motivations that actually indicated that information is a crucial quantity. And the phenomenon that I'm going to describe today is actually a quite striking phenomenon, which surprised me when I first saw it. And originally I didn't understand it. I thought it's nonsense. And later I thought maybe it gives us an understanding why evolution might be actually able to use information as a shaper of where it goes to, and in fact a driving ride. I will briefly at the end mention empowerment. Everybody expects me to say something about it, but the main talk is not about that. So I will disappoint you if you expect empowerment. It comes at the end and only briefly. Can you all hear me well? Okay, I will try to keep the microphone in this distance. It's really an exercise I don't particularly enjoy. So basically, the phenomenon we will be trying to get to is the piggybacking effect. And let me just mention that in this whole line of work, not just this one, but the whole information theory work they've been doing, there's a huge amount of people involved, and it's a community. So it's not a single person's work. Stas, by the way, is, where is he on the list? Here he is. And he's sitting in the flesh over there. Hi, Stas. Thanks for coming. I like this quote by Oscar Wilde, who I think would have enjoyed our TikTok times. It is a very sad thing that nowadays there is so little useless information. It's so true. I mean, unbelievably prescient. So let me start with the following issue. You have an organism, and the organism performs and does some things, and it has an effectiveness. And effectiveness, think of it as utility or fitness or whatever it is by which you measure the performance of the organism. On the other hand, it has an efficiency. What is an efficiency? And concretely, when I'm speaking about efficiency, I'm thinking about how much information do I need to make decisions. I make decisions, I use 2 bits for the decision, so 1 bit. If I use fewer bits, I have to look at fewer things to make the same decisions. I'm better. And you can yourself convince yourself of this. You play a new video game never done before, and there are all things blinking and all kinds of sensors. You pay attention to everything, and you are really not very good. With time, you learn that in the earlier levels, all you care about is your health, for example. And then you ignore everything else. So you minimize the intake of information, you become more efficient, and at the beginning, while you're not fully developed, essentially efficiency and effectiveness improve in concert. Think of it as like 2 agents essentially doing one. You want to be more efficient in your information processing because you become more efficient, you are faster in decision making, but you want to become also more effective. You want to survive better, get more food, more procreation, whatever it is that you're looking for. And as long as both work together, or don't compete with each other, you can move up in this gray area, which is basically the viability space. At some point, you reach a trade-off curve. This is the point at which additional efficiency you have to pay for by being less effective. You say, I want to use less information, I have to pay by being less effective. Or I want more effectiveness, I need more information to do this extra, achieve this extra utility. These trade-off curves can be computed and are closely related with the rate distortion theory from Shannon, but its use in decision making is relatively new. With one exception, Stratonovich had a note about that in the 60s. I should mention that. Okay, so once you reach this point, however, it's a bit like in politics. You have these 2 agents. One wants to minimize optimize efficiency, being cheap. Other one wants to maximize the effectiveness. And the problem is these two politicians, as long as they somehow don't work against each other, it's all good. You reach a Pareto curve, you reach an impasse. You can't move on one direction to improve one direction without the other one having to pay a price. It becomes essentially a kind of zero-sum game or near zero-sum game at the Pareto surface. So you're stuck. And imagine that you evolve and you end up in this Pareto curve. That's very bad. Now, this could be the end of the story. But it turns out there's a bit more inside this question. So first of all, let me just summarize what we just said. Imagine, for example, the actuators are driven to utilize extra information. If you have more information than you are currently utilizing, you think, oh, well, I can do more with that. I can maybe open up new niches. The sensoric apparatus is driven to minimize consumption. This is a tendency because if you have more consumption, it's more energy, more space, it's more disruptive, and it's also slower. Okay, so you have an arms race where a sensor, for example, allows new behavior because it becomes better. The actuator, the behavior changes. The sensor adapts to new behavior, and so basically they co-evolve. We have been talking about agency all the time, but here I'm treating actually an agent as two agents: sensing and acting, effectiveness and efficiency. Basically, the same agent has actually multiple drives that actually don't work necessarily against each other, but also not necessarily together. So, to summarize what I said earlier, below the trade-off curve, both sensors and actuators actually cooperate. They both improve efficiency and effectiveness. Once they're at the trade-off curve, they become antagonistic. And if you wanted to optimize and adapt further, they would have to be highly coordinated in that. There's no direct reason for this to happen. And the question is, why does nature seem to be relatively good at nevertheless doing that? So evolution adaptation along the trade-off curve seems a priori difficult. However, and here is the 2 minutes version of a tutorial talk that I gave with 3 hours of storytelling. And in fact, this talk is such that people came into the talk, it was a tutorial, and did not leave. And the reason for that is one anecdote after the other is absolutely amazing in learning what happens in sensor evolution in nature. It is such a collection of weird and surprising effects. Here I'll give you just a few highlights. For example, you have exaptation between niches. So you have amphibians that hear with their lungs. That's not what lungs are for originally, but they hear with their lungs. There's another one, there is an infrared sense of rattlesnakes. The infrared sense of rattlesnakes or pit vipers works by, they have little pits, the pit vipers, the little pits in their cheeks. And these pits are actually operating like pinhole cameras for infrared. And they use skin, a thin skin layer to detect the infrared, the impinging infrared on that skin. Now, the interesting part about that is this is the same nerve that you have in your skin, the trigeminal nerve. So evolutionarily, it basically reconfigured the nerve.
Another interesting thing is that they are basically like reusing heat receptors.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the heat receptors are reused, used differently for completely different purpose. I don't have to mention bats, of course. They use ears to see. Right, it's a visual modality to be a bat. And I should mention also one of my favorite example, that is Ornia ochracea, which is a little fly, not very large, and it is a parasite of crickets. And it has ears, or it can hear the crickets at a resolution of an angle of 2 degrees. I would like to remind you, this fly is that big. Okay, so it has extremely high angular resolution. The sensors that are being used for that are evolutionarily, originally, sensors that were used for head movement detection. There's a classic acceptation. So one sensor being reused elsewhere. Why does that work? So I have another thing, and that is a different type of line. This is horizontal evolution, so evolution from one niche to another. But you can also look at the following. There are evolution to the limit, to the perfection, basically everything that can be reached with the possible physical limitations. And here's one: the toad receptors identify individual photons. This is old work, but by now it has been shown that even in human eyes, after adaptation, or if you're an astronomer, they can detect individual photons. That is as good as it gets. There's no reason for that. Actually, we are not nocturnal. We don't live in the night, unless you are a student. But normally, basically, there's no reason to expect you should have this resolution. There's another one. The inner ear force difference detection is close to the thermal noise limit. That is the best you can do. That's close to the physical limit for little children. Again, after you pass your disco phase, that's no longer the case. But the interesting part about that, these types of physically near optimal sensoric solutions seem to be pervasive. It's not a one-off. It's relatively rare that you end up in a solution that is quite far away from the optimum. You see that, for example, very limited animals like snails. They are very slow. They don't need fast sensors. They don't need high resolution, etc. But in higher mammals, they're usually at the limit, and many other animals are operating at the limit. So the question are two questions. How to adapt along the Pareto surface, because you need that both for the cross-niche evolution and for the evolution towards the optimum. And question, is there a driver for sensor evolution to the ultimate physical limits? Is there some driver? Well, you probably know the answer already because I'm giving the talk. So if you know me a little bit, you will know the answer is probably information theory. And I want to go straight into the model that you can use to try to answer this question. So it's an interesting and long story, but I will make the story quite quick here. I give you just a sketch of the idea. The idea is what matters is information, and not just any old information, only relevant information. What is relevant information? Relevant information is that information that actually contributes to improving your utility. So if my utility is improved by pressing the left button rather than the right, all I want to know is it left or right button, right? This is all I want to distinguish, nothing else. If I have a more complicated map between a state and utility, then this map will look differently. Now, relevant information, so basically the mutual information that you need to achieve a given utility. So think of it, if you have a single decision, if you have reinforcement learning, it's a bit more complicated to compute. We can discuss that if you're interested, but for now, just assume you have one decision to make, you get a payoff, and now I'm saying can you hear me? Yeah. It sounded like the speaker has disappeared. So if you cannot hear me, please tell me. I'll raise my voice or ask for. So if you have utility, want to reach a certain utility level, you need a certain amount of information to do that. And if you're ready to work with the lower utility level, you're happy to do with less utilities, you need less resolution, you might do with less information. That's basically it. So relevant information in the more general sense, we will talk about the case for the optimal utility. If I don't talk about optimal utility, I'll let you know. But in principle, you don't have to be optimal, you just have to say what the level is. In everything I'm talking now, I will only talking about optimal utility. So I'm asking how much information do I need to make the optimal decision in a particular state. So What is that? So let's assume you have a world state, WT, that's a random variable, and you take an action A at time t. So what's the action A at time t? Let's assume it's a maze. In our case, it's actually a maze. There's a little critter, and the critter has to get to a target. And the optimal route is picking an action that it might be ambiguous. If it's ambiguous, then the action can be either one or the other direction. And the algorithm, the rate distortion, will pick the best distribution that minimizes the mutual information that you need to do that. So if there are multiple solutions, you pick the one that is cheapest in terms of information use, right? So if you don't need to distinguish, you do not distinguish. That's the first thing. So this will be called, I'll call here, the core relevant information. It's just the true information you need. Now, however, we are talking about an agent with sensors to model the fact that natural agents do not have full access to the world state. And so in other words, we have a Markov chain between the world leading to a sensor, leading to an actuator. The sensor will change as we'll talk later, but for now, basically, I'll talk about a specific sensor. But the sensor will change as in the procedure, so it will not be a fixed throughout the experiment. And basically, a good sensor is one where the sensor, whatever it is, gives the A exactly the same amount of information as the world actually needs, or as the actual decision-making needs from the world. So we have the relevant information. This is the relevant information. And if the sensor has the same value as the relevant information, it captures everything you need for that purpose.
The good sensor is the one that extracts from the world everything that you need to maximize your utility.
Exactly. And in addition, I want to minimize what it extracts. So I'm going to be very parsimonious. I try not to pick anything I don't need. Only stuff I need, nothing I don't need. This is basically the classic setup of an information bottleneck, right? So you extract the information you need and just the information you need. Okay, so here's the critter. There's a critter, there's a goal, very boring world, couple of obstacles. And now we consider an information optimal policy, some policy that is optimal, so it performs the best possible action in each step. It's a grid world, so it's just horizontal, vertical moves, and minimizes the information that it needs. And a possible sensor is like that. What is a sensor? A sensor is here simply projection of the state onto given clusters. So this is a sensor state. So any state here is belonging to one sensor state. Any state here is belonging to one sensor state, and so on. And this is basically the solution for this problem. Good.
Wait, hang on.
Yeah.
That grid is the optimal.
That clustering, that projection to states is the optimal solution for that particular problem.
Intuitive somehow? Clear to see that it needs this information?
You could probably take it apart, but that's not so interesting here. It's not the main point of what I'm trying to make. But yes, you could sit down and ask why is that optimal. And it turns out it's simply the minimum amount of information you need for the decision making. And now I can ask the following. Yes?
I can ask, but so the way it seems to be set up, it looks like almost a reinforcement learning problem.
It is.
Right. But one thing that is not clear to me is that in a RL, the good thing is that the reward is very fine grained. Like the agent performs an action to receive a reward based on algorithms.
Yes.
Right. The problem with evolution is that, first of all, is the fitness is the reward you receive, right?
Yeah.
But you receive it only at the end. Like at the end, once you have like some children, yes. And so it's not very fine grained. And there are of course also problems of many different factors that maybe the agent is performing something nice, but then it's in an environment which is hostile, and so like kind of like there's a lot of noise even though the action is correct. And the third problem is RL is about learning. Evolution is you are endowed with some like random gene that gives you better sensors, and then that gives you greater fitness, and so that you reproduce more. But the point is that in RL everything is probabilistic, yes, but deterministic in the sense that like if the environment is set up correctly, you always reach out suboptimal good solution. But in evolution isn't the problem that there is still the first random step of like
This is a very abstracted model. So the model, think of it as an abstracted model of a very high level, view of a huge population in equilibrium, idealized. Okay, of course, RL is about learning in the end. By the way, if we should happen to come to empowerment, that's one part of the answer, because I really thought that in real life, most rewards don't happen unless it's very punctual. You need much more feedback. But I don't want to run off on this topic. Think of it as equilibrated. Basically everything big enough, long enough, until everything is equilibrated, and then we change something, and then we look again. That's basically the abstraction that I would like you to follow me on. So, once we have this, let's assume this is the task that has been solved. Now we can ask the following question. Once you have this sensor, what other tasks does it support? You see, this is a very specific niche where the goal happens to be here. Goodbye, thank you very much. But are there other goals that you can actually achieve with the same sensor? So think of what other niche, if there's a shift in ecosystem or something, what other goals are now achievable? It means it's kind of a widening what you can survive on. Basically, it's kind of modeling the widening of what you can survive on. So in short, in our model, what other tasks would be supported by this sensor? So what other goals could it reach? And how do we do that? Ignore the dashed curve. The important curve is a dark one, the solid one. We basically looked at all the possible goals as possible goal positions, possible tasks, and sorted them by how well you will do with that sensor to solve that task. How well will you do? How well means how expensive it is to get there, how expensive the price is, a negative reward. So the more negative, the worse it is. High, if it's very low negativity, it means it's very good. And yes?
So some tasks, I guess, are not just expensive, but impossible.
Could be, yes. Not in this case. In this case, they are not impossible, but they could be impossible. Yes. So we basically sort them by quality, and basically we take the tasks that reach 45% of the maximum from the bottom line, essentially, and all these tasks, basically it's a bit like annealing. All these tasks are considered. This is now also in your niche. So you have the sensor. These tasks can all be captured by your sensors. You are able to survive in these niches. So all the tasks here basically would now become part of your ecosystem. And now you look at this and you accept basically the adaptation or acceptation to these tasks. And what we did is, now that you accepted them, you now ask, okay, I want now to evolve. You see, I'm moving from equilibration to equilibration. I'm now evolving the sensor again, or seeking a sensor that is able again to support these tasks. These tasks that I chose. And I can basically do that. When I do that, all the possible tasks are on the circle, 45 points on the circle for each task that is allowed. And I basically can travel from one task to another and acceptate from one task to another. Yeah, exactly. And in quite a few steps, I can travel through the space across in this acceptation. So I basically have a sensor that can accept up to 95% quality of task. And if I evolve for that task to improve the sensor to 100%, I can make this step. And it turns out it's highly connected, this space. I can travel from task to task without much difficulty. So this is one thing. And essentially, if a niche disappears, it means I can escape that niche. I don't have the fight between the actuator and the sensor to stay. Who wins now? I want to be efficient. I want to be effective. I don't have this fight. I can move from between these niches with relative ease. And now this was acceptation, sideways movement. Yes.
So for this figure, and for each of these tasks, these three obstacles were in the same location.
The obstacles were not moving, only the goals.
So if it's densely connected or not, I guess it depends on how you.
This is a very specific experiment, but I will later give an argument why we think this is possibly a generic phenomenon. Yeah, so it's not a proof, but it's an indication that this phenomenon is not just luck. We now look at another one. Right now we're talking about acceptation. So you move one task to another. But now I'm going to look at inclusive adaptation. What's inclusive? Inclusive means I want to add the task to my repertoire. So I want to be able to do this task and this task and this task and this task. So in other words, I'm going to add niches as adaptation proceeds. So what is the idea? You want to maximize the expectation of the value, given the state, given action, and all the possible goal tasks that are currently included in my goal set. And you want to maximize this in expectation, and you want to perform well on all tasks, not one, just specific one. So it's not a specific acceptation to a specific goal. You want to be universalist. Think of it. Resolving an image at high resolution. You want to resolve all images, not just the ones at a particular point of your, with a particular color or particular property. So, here's the model that we used, and I'll show you the results in a second. So, assume that you have a sensor that's optimal for all past tasks. So, it reaches the optimal performance for all tasks that you already covered. If you start at the beginning, it's just one task. Now, get a new task for which S is near optimal. Remember, we had this experiment where we listed all the tasks and what tasks, for which task is our sensor near optimal. For those who it's optimal, I don't need to do anything, but there are some tasks that it's suboptimal for. These are the ones that are interesting. I pick one of them. I take a relevant information optimal direct policy. So I take a policy that's relevant information optimal for that one. And I seek the minimal optimal addition to my sensor via the information bottleneck. So how does it look formally? This is our relevant information. That's the true information I need. I'm adding S prime to my original sensor in such a way that it will reach that relevant information. And I basically minimize that. I want to add the minimum, just a second, a minimum extra sensor that will now make the full sensor optimal for the new task. Yes?
IWA also be like dependent on the goals or the goal set because you are adding new goals and this changes your...
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay.
It does.
We assume that it's like the different IWA had like competition times that when you like slightly smaller goal set.
Yes, it's a sloppy notation, yes. So essentially you would do a minimal addition. There's an algorithm to do that. It's described in the paper how to do that. The point is, so you basically now combine S and S prime into an equivalent minimal extended sensor that adds those new tasks to the existing goal set. And when you do that, you see how it works. So you get a sensor goals that being added, a goal 1 that was original goal 2, 3, and these are the goals that are being added. And the interesting thing that you see here is in this curve here, as we go through the tasks that are being added, essentially in only very few epochs, you are almost at the point where you can do almost all tasks right away. Whoosh! It goes to maximal power, almost. And it takes only a bit more and it reaches maximal resolution. Once it's here, essentially every task can be carried out at optimal level. Yes?
By that point, you basically have the highest resolution center already, where every square is its own state.
No, but you can do any tasks available. Yeah? So in this case, it doesn't need maximal resolution, right? But this is a very simple scenario either. But you can do every task at top resolution, at top performance. So now the question is, oh well, we picked this scenario, does it work always? Is this typical? And naively you would say not obvious that it is. But the reason we chose, we did this experiment was actually conjecture. And that conjecture came from an effect that information bottlenecks show, and that people who do computational mechanics know actually as crypticity. But I like to call it differently because I feel it's more transparent in what it's doing. So let me have a look what it is. So we note first of all, it's easy to transit between niches, and you get a very fast refinement towards full information. Full information doesn't mean full resolution. All information you need to do whatever your organism's niche requires. So the question is it an artifact? Or is it generic? So this is the theory that drove us to this experiment. So if you have an information bottleneck, what we find is in general that the information that the world stores in the sensor at an optimal information bottleneck exceeds the information between the world and the actuator. That is not surprising, that is just the data processing inequality. What is surprising, however, is that this is usually not just a little bit larger, it can be orders of magnitudes larger. I recommend reading Shalizi. He uses it beautifully to make a definition of emergence. So it's in the Shalizi's PhD thesis. Beautiful piece of work, by the way, worth reading. So this is much, much larger. And now the question, yes?
Orders of magnitude differences based on empirical observations about real world sensors?
No, it is simply if I give you this line world sensor actuator, I minimize, I pick an optimal strategy that's information optimal. The relevant information may be 1 bit, so you need to decide left or right. But this information that the sensor actually needs to pick up from the world might be 100 bits. Or 10 bits, or 5 bits.
Oh, okay, so this is pick a lot of information, gather a lot of information, keep you the relevant bit.
Yes, yes, and that is surprising, or at least we did not understand where this comes from, or what that means. We have an interpretation of that, but it's a long story. I will not do that here. I will just show you what it gives us, or what it suggests. So basically, Shalizi calls that predictive inefficiency. Susanne Still called that useless nostalgia, this concept. We like to call that a little bit different. We try to argue it's not waste, but you can recycle it. You can recycle it. We are really ecological here. So let me show you. It is a bit what we call a piggyback information. It is information that your sensors get, although your actuators don't need it. Let me rephrase that again. You have information in the sensors that you did not ask for, that you don't want, you didn't use it, but it has to be taken in. Now, evolutionary systems don't like to be wasteful. You see it, okay, you get the point. They don't like to be wasteful, so this is extra information. Can we do something with that? Okay, I see, yeah, you got the point. So this is the idea. maybe this information, if it's there, is opening new niches or is allowing us to do more. And that is basically the reason we did this experiment. So let's have a look. You have unused information piggybacking on relevant information. So it might actually be the reason why you have actually leeway to travel between niches, because there is more information. So it's not a compromise between some dirty politicians to move from one niche to the other, but there is actually for both of them, yeah, we can find a compromise because there are tunneling opportunities to other niches. Or else you have new uses of existing information, and you can actually add to that, and that pushes you further and further and further until you reach other limits, like energy, like resolution, like you have no space anymore for your cells, or heat production. If you have, for example, these heat sensors, they are limited in their resolution by how fast you can get rid of the heat, because that creates a latency. If you can't get rid of the heat of your heat sensor, you have a latency that's too slow to detect whatever you want. So here's a slight model for what how I like to think of it. Think of the environment. The interesting information is dark gray, and the bubbles are useless stuff. Here you have the sensors that pick up some stuff and the actuators that use some of the stuff. So this is dark corresponding to the useful information. So the actuators now are able to do more because the sensors have this option of have more information about the world than originally needed. So the actuators create more. Now you evolve the sensors, you go into the new equilibrated mode. The sensors increase because you equilibrate again. The actuators equilibrate after them, and you see there are fewer and fewer bubbles. The bubbles are basically useless stuff, and less of it becomes useless. And so as the sensor grow, the useless information becomes less and less, and the actuators grow, and so on. And so this basically continues until you hit some hard limits. Energy, space, time, whatever it is. Okay, this is kind of an illustration of what I would suggest is an effect of this piggyback information. Yes, please.
But when you say that, so the sensors get more information that the actuators actually need and then the actuator finds a way to use that information to perform. But this improvement is on the same task, or potentially also on different tasks the organism can do?
If in this simple scenario, it would mean a new task. Okay. In the reality, it could be better resolution. For example, I'm a bird of prey. I'm hunting prey, and I'm hunting faster now because I have a better resolution, and so on. And this pushes itself to the limit. So the argument here is that this purely informational argument, completely informational, there's no physics, there's pure math, might explain why evolution might actually often drive to these extreme performances in specific fields, because the information actually creates a kind of preferred advantage to actually use this information. It's a bit like, you get funding money, and then you start doing a thing and it works, and now you get more funding money, and now you feel compelled to continue, right? In a way, you keep going. You push this further and further. So essentially, at this point, this is basically where I suggest piggyback information is a possible explanation for why nature really is pushing into these niches or acceptating successfully. It's a hypothesis. Anyone that has an idea how you could actually evidence that with either existing data or with experiments, that would be welcome. As you see, there's lots of assumptions, equilibration, and so on. But I do think that it's otherwise, I find it difficult to explain that, especially in higher organisms that have a lot of potential, the limits are really pushed to the absolute limit, even when it's not obviously needed. And one question: how much time do I have? 20 minutes. Okay, that means I can talk a little bit more about empowerment. I'm sure that this is what you paid for. Yes, sorry.
Just a comment, because it's fresh in my mind and I'll probably forget it. This I'm trying to map this onto, say, current AI technology. Where could this arise? And it makes me think of multimodal models where it seems to be that if you start by training on language, that ends up going better as you then train on other tasks or different modalities. And part of this I'm seeing is like, to do well at learning language, you have to kind of reconstruct the whole world effectively. You have this crypticity or whatever you end up calling it here. And then I think you're saying that that understanding of the world then is maybe not optimal, but also useful for, say, visual stuff.
Yes.
And so it's already a good start. And then when you train on that, then you grow again, and all of these things feedback on themselves in a way which might be very real in current models.
It is an arms race. Yes.
That's one thing, but also I think it goes to the result that like if you train the language model more on like it's like more code and math first, then it becomes like better at doing some other kinds of stuff that don't involve code.
Yeah.
So the basic idea here is that it might be, the generalization might be baked in informationally. This is something that I, at this point, would find still difficult to hard prove, but I feel I wanted to share it with you. Maybe one of you has an idea how to actually approach this. Personally, I find that the most interesting application use case is actually sensor evolution, because it would explain why evolution is so effective. We always ask, oh, there is this and this mechanism, that mechanism. I like to have arguments that are mechanism free, because they would not depend on a particular pathway in the metabolic network that has this magic property, but rather it would be a systemic property that if you have not one pathway, another pathway will do too. That is why I would prefer that. Anyway, but that's kind of the main message of this talk. And now the question is whether you prefer discussion or you want to give me to give an example of empowerment in sensor evolution, whatever you prefer. So it's audience participation.
Maybe just something empowerment.
Empowerment. Okay. Yeah. Shall I do the Stephen Ballmer? Empowerment. You know that, yeah? If you don't know that, those who don't, look up developers. You know that one. Anyway, so a brief motivation, and it's a relatively short introduction because I wanted just to talk about sensor evolution here, mostly. So basically, and this answers one of the questions that you mentioned. In biology, success is basically survival. If you survive, you're successful. If you don't, you're not. And it's not just your survival, it's also survival of your offspring. But let's just look at you. The concept of tasks and reward is not sharp. It's not clear what a task is. Eating is a pretty clear thing. There are a couple of clear things, but many things are not. And what's worse, the search space is sparse and it is large. That is really not a good position to start on. And the assumption of pure naive Darwinism, by the way, Darwin was not a naive Darwinist. I have to defend him. He was actually quite smart on that point, but naive Darwinists say feedback by death. Okay? So it's a bit like you go and study and study and study, and then there's an exam and the answer is fail. Not very helpful to learn, right? So one argument is, well, organisms have dense networks that guide them. Okay, that's true. And these networks clearly store a lot of information, but they are also very species specific. And every species needs to find their own networks. What is, if I'm a naked mole, then I live in a 15% CO2 atmosphere and it doesn't hurt me, and I can handle that. If I do that as a human, it really is painful. It's really not what you want. The second thing is, if you do that for artificial agents, say you build a robot, a humanoid robot or something, and you have, for every robot you have to recalibrate it yourself, and it's a big mess. And the fact that evolutionary success is so widespread, you wonder, are there not some more fundamental principles at work? So here there are lots of other models. I don't have the time to go through them, but look under the term intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the big term. The first person that actually used this term, introduced this term, is Jürgen Schmidhuber, 1992, I think, or 91, I forgot the year. And one of the first people who had a concrete way of doing that was Ralph Deer with his homeokinesis principle. Read it up, it's very nice. If you want to look it up, I recommend the website The Playful Machine. It has lots of very, very fun videos working with Ralph Deer's homeokinesis principle. But here, of course, I will talk about a different ansatz, namely the informational impedance match, or that's how you can view it. If you're an organism and you have a sensor, you have an actuator, you want the actuator to do things that your sensors pick up and your sensors to pick up things that your actuators do. Because if I do stuff and I don't pick it up, what's the point of having this sensor? What's the point? And the actuator is undirected. I don't know whether it will do anything sensible. I need that they somehow fit together. So the idea is if I have a cavefish, for example, and it lives in the dark, I don't need eyes, and the cavefish indeed are become blind. What they work with is a line organ. Or if I have a deep sea fish, they live in the dark, but their actuators produce light. So they actually have eyes and can see very well with the light produced by the actuator. So basically you want to maximize the potential that whatever you inject into the environment by your actuators can be recaptured from the environment by your sensors. This is the idea of empowerment. Empowerment comes from social sciences. We took the term from social sciences. Namely, you can change your environment and you know that you can change your environment, or in an inimitable way that was actually stated by Tobias Jung, one of my former PhD students. I thought it was the best way of saying it. Being in control of one's destiny is good. And knowing it. You need to know that you're in control of your destiny. It's not enough just to be in control. So basically it's an information theoretic version. I'm sorry about that. There's some formatting problem here. Information theoretic version of combined controllability and observability. You basically want to be able to control the world and observe it, but it's information theoretic. Therefore, you get essentially a whole spectrum of values. It's not just discrete values, and you can handle noise, etc. So all these things are included. So as a sketch how it works, imagine this is a causal Bayesian network, and basically causal Bayesian network has a world, a sensor, a memory. Think of it as a processor, an actuator, the world, impinges in the world, and so on and so on. We kick away the memory, we kick away the link between actuator and sensor, sensor and actuator rather. Now imagine I start here, right, the world is in the state here, these are all random variables. I do mess with this action, I have some distribution here, do something, throw a stone, whatever. Wait a second, throw another stone over the wall. Wait a second, throw another stone over the wall. And now I'm listening. And now somebody gets upset. Or I hear glass breaking or whatever it is. And now basically I ask, okay, how much of these actions is actually visible in my sensor? And I'm not just asking that, we can actually measure it. You can treat that as an information channel. And so what you do is, you essentially define so-called free will actions. It's the philosophers, please don't listen to that. Okay, free will actions just simply mean I can choose whatever I want as a distribution, and I can ask, okay, maximize the mutual information of my freely chosen actions with the finally observed sensor. Maximize this. And I was a little bit careless. I should have said this actually depends on where I'm starting, and that's a particular state in the world, for example. Could be also a context, doesn't have to be an objective state, could be a context, could be a partially observable context. There's no requirement that it's fully objective, but I will now, for simplicity, assume you know the state of the world as an observer. And given the state of the world, I look at the maximum mutual information that my actions can send into my target sensor given the current state of the world, maximize over this joint distribution. The distribution is joint, the actions may depend on each other. And this is just a more compact notation. This is empowerment. It's a channel capacity between the sequence's actuations to the final observed sensor state. So, why I'm showing it again? No, I don't. Now what I'm going to do is the following. Yes?
In fact, before you mentioned empowerment is control of your own destiny and knowing it. It seems in this definition that it's really mostly about the knowing and not really controlling the future.
No, your actions are causal. So this is the potential future actions that you could take. So assume that the sensor is no sensor, you observe everything. So it basically says how many changes can you make to the world that you can distinguish. So it's real control. Yeah, the observation is important because it matters to your sensor, and we need it here for the evolutionary experiment I'm going to do. But yes, it's about control. Control is essentially, if you don't have control, you have no empowerment. So here's the example. I have a little world, and there's a chemical substance here, and the chemical substance concentrates here, and it gets less and less concentrated around the center. And I'm going to place an agent at these different locations, one here, one here, one here, one here, one here. And each of the agents is allowed to evolve its sensors. What are its sensors? It simply places antennas around it at a certain certain distance. And there are 16 of these locations, and it's allowed to measure the chemical density there, and the highest one will fire. So you get up to 1 of 16. It's hot, one hot coding of 1 of 16 sensor things, so maximally 4 bits. And there are actuations. You can do a 4-step empowerment, so you have 4 actions that you can take in the east, northeast, southwest. And now I'm asking, what is the sensor configurations that maximizes my empowerment? So I'm evolving, because in evolution, question again, what's the feedback that I'm getting? If I'm using empowerment as feedback, which is very immediate, I can ask, what is the sensor configuration that maximizes my empowerment under these constrained actions? And it turns out that these are the solutions. If you are sitting in the center, it's essentially a blob with a bit of dirt around it, but essentially a blob. Slightly off the center, here's my agent. It places its sensors close to the center, and you see that it's essentially an aerial sensor. It measures where am I in 2 dimensions compared to my center. It's a blob. It's an extended 2-dimensional blob that measures it. Same here for this one. This agent sits here, and it has this blob also near the center, so it can move these detection spots up to the distance of this square away from the agent itself. So it's still 2-dimensional. Once I exceed the distance, you see very nicely how the sensors collapse into one-dimensional heading sensors. So essentially what you get now for agents that are far away from the center, they can't actually get to the center, you get essentially a heading measure, a sensor that actually measures where in relation to the center am I. Yes?
What I'm looking at, so this cross in the middle is the agent.
The cross in the middle is the agent, yes.
Like it's always the center.
No, this is a bit badly noted. Each of these agents are at these particular locations in the original grid. So 0, 0. This one is at 10, 0. This one is at 20, 0. This one is at 10, 10, and so on. So they are located away, and they place a sensor, try to place it close to the center if they can, in 2-dimensional set. But when they move further out, it collapses into 1-dimensional structure. It is actually nice visualization how the ecological niche forces a completely different dimensionality of the sensor, right? And when we look at the analysis more carefully, what you will see, we evolved that one, what you see is that even here there is actually a one-dimensional solution, it's just not dominant. So they are like two, it's really a phase transition of first order. Basically you move from one minimum to another optimum, so one optimum to another optimum. It's a hard transition. It's a serious. It's clearly a first order phase transition, right? And so why I like to show this is shows first of all you can use immediate feedback or near immediate feedback to optimize that, and it shows very nicely how your niche actually decides what your sensor is going to look like, and it can actually change the character of your sensor from here 2-dimensional to 1-dimensional as you move from one niche to the other. And with this, I have run out of time, I think, and I think there's time for 2 or 3 more questions.
So one interpretation of this, like use of like junk information in the sensors by like setting yourself like additional goals, is that something like there is like a prediction or a belief that if I am sensing this, if this is included in my sensor, then this must be relevant. And this prediction is kind of like a self-fulfilling prediction, and it fulfills itself via the channel of setting additional goals. And I wonder, like, what's your take on this interpretation?
Well, it is an element of self-reinforcing belief. It might be, but the point is, it is actually referring to real information. The only point is that this information is not used now, and it basically says, well, use this, right? It basically is a bit like you buy your smartphone to set up your calendar and do mail, and then you end up doing TikToking. So basically, it is a parasitic process that does not have to be. I did not say that it's always useful.
Yeah.
What I said, it can be a runaway process.
Yeah, but is there like an underlying drive or like an abstract reason why it kind of should be this way? Why the I don't know, like selection pressure or whatever to like match your sensors, like what your sensors are sensing to the world, even if this involves like setting yourself arbitrary goals for that we can use this information for?
No, at the beginning you get a halo of extra possible goals. Right? The beginning, you have to catch this fly, and then and maybe it doesn't happen. So there are situations where you do not have much piggyback information. In that case, that's it. You're done, right? So if you're a fly, for example, and you have optical flow, you're set up perfectly for what you need to do. You need to fly around and land on fecal matter, right? And then on the food of some humans, right? So that's your job. And optical flow is known that you can use it to navigate very little critters very, very efficiently. In this case, I would claim, I haven't done the computation, I would bet that optical flow is actually has very low piggyback. In other words, you get what you need and nothing else. But when that's not happening, then you get this runaway effect.
Yeah, I guess in the case of like when you have like a lot of piggybacking,
yes,
it kind of compels the critter to reuse like the lineage of critters.
Well, it's just evolution. You simply have the option, and it improves your viability. You have essentially more space for variability. If you basically you have a bigger niche. And it can specialize, right? And maybe the critter, Ornea just parasites this one cricket. It cannot do anything else, and its hearing is not universal.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe at the end, when how the sensor is for this little fly, maybe it can't evolve further, right? It's stuck in this niche and will not get out. So there's no guarantee that this one will always work. It's just if you have piggyback, I claim you have an unstable, evolutionary unstable or highly mobile scenario, which makes it easy to evolve elsewhere or further. That would be my prediction. Any further questions? If not, I'm happy to discuss further. I'm around. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Like another minor, maybe interesting thing that stands out to me is that like the degree towards which like this piggyback information can be used for some like new niches, new goals, is like a function of the environment, among other things. But the environment, in the case of biological creatures, is itself like largely other biological creatures.
Sure.
These biological creatures like evolve via like if your conjecture is correct, we have this this mechanism of sensor evolution. So in a sense, we have this kind of interesting loopiness, the process kind of recursion